Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome online conversation, mainstreaming human rights and preserving national unity in Malaysia. This online conversation is co-organized by Persatuan Promosi Hak Asasi Manusia, PROHAM, KSI, Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, and together with Dialog Rakyat. So as we know, human rights is coming back as a major agenda in Malaysia's foreign policy with the implications for domestic human rights practice. So in seeking for a place as a member of the Human Rights Council for the 2022 to 2024 term, Malaysia issued a voluntary pledges and commitments recently. In the pledge, Malaysia made promises to cooperate with the Office of the UN High Commissioners for Human Rights towards the promotions of human rights in the country and globally as well. So if we recall, on the 31st December 2020, Malaysia joined another 105 other UN member states to sign the UN General Assembly resolutions to call for the concrete actions for the eliminations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and the comprehensive implementations of the follow-up to the Durban Declaration and Program of Actions. At the same time, recently also we see Malaysia has issued its voluntary national review at the UN High-Level Political Forum on the SDGs. Under review is also the SDGs 16, which is on peace, justice, and inclusive societies. Another related development is the launch of a new publication by Professor Dr. Denison, Jayasooria, entitled Understanding ICERT in the Wider Context of the Federal Constitutions, Human Rights, and Malaysia Society at the Human Rights 365 Group meeting on June 25th, hosted by the UN Malaysia country team. And this publication is co-published by the United Nations Malaysia and the KITA in UKM. Therefore, with a high foreign policy reference to human rights, building inclusive societies and in preserving our national unity is very important for us to review Malaysia's human rights commitment with a special focus on addressing racism domestically and globally in the context of preserving our national unity. So today, online conversations, we will have the welcoming remarks by Tan Sri Michael Yeoh, PROHAM Chair, as well as the KSI President. Follow up with that, we will then have a panel sessions of 6 panelists to share with us their views and thoughts on these issues. And then we will open up for discussions with the closing remarks by Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Omar Abdul Rahman. So without further ado, I would like to first invite Tan Sri Michael Yeoh to present the welcoming remarks. Tan Sri.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koo, for your introductory remarks. Dr. Denison, Tan Sri Omar, Prof. Dr. Shad, and all our other distinguished speakers with us this afternoon. A very warm welcome to today's conversation, which we believe is very crucial, very important at this juncture of our history, where we need to have greater unity and greater respect for human rights. I think at any time, more than at any time before, I think today we need to ensure that human rights is better defended and better protected, as well as the need to respect our federal constitution and to help ensure national unity. I think for a long time, many of us have been advocating that public policy and national unity should be on a human rights approach and human rights dimension. Because if we practice human rights in implementing public policies, the country would become a lot more united. So perhaps let's focus on how we can mainstream human rights in public policy and in upholding and practicing national unity in this country. At the same time, I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of the importance of the federal constitution, to uphold the federal constitution at all times. And we are delighted we have Professor Dr. Shad with us this afternoon, one of our leading constitutional experts, to share his thoughts with us. At the same time, we also need to ensure that Malaysia live up to its international obligations. And PROHAM would like to once again reiterate the call to the Malaysian government to ratify all of the international human rights conventions. And the book that Dr. Denison and Kita has come up with on ICET, I think is worth looking into, because that is one of the key conventions that we should be discussing as well. And as I said earlier, Malaysia must uphold its obligations to ratify all the UN international conventions. So I do hope that during today's discussions, we can have a good conversation, hear from our many experts, but more importantly, we have a number of young speakers here, so we can take into account and consideration the voice of the youth as well. So thank you very much for being with us here this afternoon. I hand over now to Dr. Denison to commence the proceedings.
Very much, Tan Sri. So I would just like to ask the attendees you can use the question and answer buttons if you have any questions while the panelists are giving their presentations. And just to let you know that Professor Shad Faruqi and Ms. Serene will be leaving our conversations much earlier. So if you have any questions for them right away after their presentations, please do so. Thank you very much. Yeah, Datuk, over to you.
Thank you very much to all the panel speakers, Tan Sri's professors, colleagues and friends. Also to all the participants who have agreed to join this discussion. I'm setting the stage. Ingui just now highlighted some of the points on mainstreaming human rights and preserving national unity in Malaysia. Some reflections from me with a focus on the ICET document. Next, please. So this point was raised, but I thought it is important for us to re-look at why we are saying this government at Putrajaya is taking on at the international stage human rights, which is good, but at the same time that information must be disseminated locally and discussed, and also becomes an important public policy agenda, not just for foreign policy and international, but also local. So we feel, and in talking to the PROHAM leadership, we felt that there was a climate for engagement in policy dialogue and to intensify our policy advocacy, because Malaysia brought out this document, voluntary pledges and commitments, which makes a fairly good commitment to the global and domestic levels on human rights. So that needs to be highlighted and well known in the public. And secondly, we also highlighted this, the UN resolution on a global call to combat racism. And when I first saw this, I was a little surprised that this government took and signed this resolution. But then when I reviewed back to the Durban conference, Malaysia has consistently supported the international resolutions at this level, although it didn't subscribe to ICET. And so it's a forum that as recent as last year, they signed, and so there is a commitment by the government to combat racism. The UPR work which Comango and other civil society organizations are doing with the foreign ministry is something maybe Jerald or Ryan might want to highlight afterwards, but it's definitely engagements. But more recently, Malaysia released the VNR report, and in that report on page 128, there is a commitment to increase awareness and capacity building to human rights. SDG 16, they highlight some of the challenges, some ways forward, but the commitment to ratify other human rights conventions was not there in the VNR report, but it's something that's there in the UPR process. So the stage is set for us too. And it's in that context that I thought a reintroduction of this material. Next, please. On ICERT, this book is available. There is a soft copy because we couldn't send it to the printers. It's online. The Secretariat can pass to all of you. This is freely available. It was written some time ago, but only launched this year. Next. And I'll quickly go through this. Reasons for the publication largely is to put all the materials together of what people argued. It's like now this emergency ordinance. There is a lot of what we call in Malaysian society kelang kabut thinking. So we are not sure A says this, B says this, and so forth. So we wanted to put it together to note what was said by whom, and then make a reasonable, rational, provide the space for that discussion, and then drive it into policy advocacy and so forth. We also realize most of this material is not in Bahasa Melayu, and this document has been translated, including ICERT and other materials, taking on from the work KOMAS and others had done in the Malay publication that will come out sometime in September. Next. So the methodology is simple. It was a review of social media, materials, personalities, handset report, and this 91-page document in a Q&A form was published. Next. The outline is straightforward, 4 chapters, the scene. It sets ICERT not just as a topic on race and confronting racial discrimination, it's setting it in the context of the federal constitution, in the context of human rights and Malaysian society, because the objectives to it were questioning the fundamentals of the UDHR and the federal constitution and so forth. And it's in that context that ICERT is set. The appendices has the full text, recommendations, the provisions of Article 153, which many in one section of Malaysian society felt was being threatened. Next. I think I'll move through this quite fast. Next, please. The Malaysian Constitution, much of this is taken from Professor Shad Faruqi's work, but it describes the constitutions and constitutional background as a more lay person writing it for lay readers as well. Next. The human rights, United Nations, ICERT, the instruments that are there and so forth. Next. Also in terms of now specific to ICERT, it's then addressing some questions. How did Asian countries, which countries ratified it? What about OIC countries? What about ASEAN countries? So various Q&A were answered to then show of the 57 OIC countries, 55, including Saudi Arabia and all, Pakistan and all, have ratified ICERT, Egypt, and so forth. And the reservations that they made doesn't have the kind of arguments people have raised. Next. So the conclusions are basically, it's a pointer if ICERT is ratified or not, readers to review the ICERT team and the final conclusions, looking at human rights, Malaysian federal constitution, parliamentary democracy, looking at the balance of the federal constitution. ICERT in the arguments, and it develops, it will not be in conflict with Article 153, but the provisions of 153, if it looked as special rights and not as affirmative action or positive action to offset historical disadvantage, then it may be deemed as discriminatory under the ICET definition. So there are implications that the document also highlights. Next. So concluding reflections on this, that it is quite critical and important that in the context of the federal constitution, there is no racial superiority or dominance of one community against another. And it is important for us in Malaysian society to restore fostering shared history, a commitment for non-discrimination and equality, and also a revisit of the NUCC report, like the National Harmony Act, to address hate speech and to foster community mediation. So the document is a helpful reader, and it is helpful to set the arguments and to move the agenda forward for the ratification. That would be my key submission to mainstream, and Malaysia would then have to seriously take this in the context that it's among the very few countries that have not ratified ICET, and to benchmark race relations at the global level, because Malaysia is benchmarking Malaysia in other areas like education, healthcare, income categories, and so forth. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Datuk, for sharing us with us your thought on these issues. And the book, Understanding ICET in the Wider Context of the Federal Constitution, Human Rights and Malaysian Societies, is available for the soft copy, as you can see the link as shared by the Secretariat. And I think the recommendations made by Prof. Denison is important, as in the revisit the NUCC report, as well as the suggestion to enact the National Harmony Act. And without further ado, I would like to invite our second panelist, Professor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Saleem Faruqi, also a PROHAM member, and he's also the holder of the Tunku Abdul Rahman Chair in the University of Malaya. Over to you, Prof.
So much. Now I'm going to speak on a slightly broader terrain than Dr. Denison. I'm talking about mainstreaming human rights and national unity, but in the broader context of the Constitution. Let me first point out that the human rights situation in Malaysia is mixed. There are many currents and cross currents. Despite many wholesome provisions in the Constitution and laws, there are historical, cultural, religious, economic, geographical, systemic, and structural issues that act as impediments to the constitutional scheme of things. Further, I wish to say that any assessment of the human rights situation in Malaysia is bound to be colored by one's perception of this majestic concept of human rights. Do human rights go beyond civil liberties to socio-economic entitlements? Are the rights of future generations, for example, and the right to sustainable development and environmental protection, are they part of the human rights jurisprudence? What about personal autonomy rights, like issues of homosexuality, cross-dressing, pornography? Are they part of fundamental freedoms? I have to confess to you that these are issues on which there is no unanimity of views, either in Malaysia or in most other countries. So the challenge for all of us then is this: can community morality and religious prescriptions justify curtailment of some of these human rights? The dilemma is this, that if you say religion is a personal matter, it's not of concern to the state, that itself amounts to a little bit of secular militancy, because if medical health is important, why is moral health not important? So these are issues on which there are differences of opinion. May I go on to slide number 4? Sorry, I have to skip quite a lot. In making our evaluation about Malaysian human rights situation, let me begin by counting our blessings. A holistic perspective of human rights can unearth much that is positive in the Malaysian body politic. The constitutional system is such that actually we have all the constituents of a constitutional state. There is a Supreme Constitution, chapter on fundamental liberties. Next slide. Judicial review is available, and I'm happy to report to you that some judges have interpreted the concepts of life, liberty, and law prismatically, so as to read into the Constitution some unenumerated, non-posited, non-textual implied rights. So life is not simply animal existence. Life is the dignity of life. Liberty is not simply freedom from arrest. Liberty is the soul's right to breathe. Law is not simply any law passed by Parliament. Law means a proportionate law. So this is a very important development. I have to skip. May I please go to slide number 11? Thank you. So there is enough in Malaysian constitutional jurisprudence to provide a renaissance in public law, constitutional law, administrative law. Some developments kindle hope that the Constitution is returning from the peripheries to the center, and that the judiciary is waking up from the judicial winter that descended on the land after the tragic Saleh Abbas episode of the late 80s. Next one. Next slide. In the socio-economic sphere, Malaysia has done fairly well before this COVID-19 hit us. I think most of you will agree that food is as important as freedom and bread as important as the ballot box. And before the COVID catastrophe, the country's success in economic development had reduced poverty significantly, kept unemployment low, and had provided a bountiful market. I think Malaysia used the economy there was a cooperative model between public and private sector, and that worked fairly well. Malaysia was globalized, the economy was globalized long before globalization. So the building of a peaceful and harmonious multiracial society was indeed exceptional and provided an environment in which human rights can flower. Only if you have lived in a country where there is shortage of food, where there is extensive poverty, where millions of people sleep on the streets and die on the streets and defecate and procreate on the streets, only then can we actually fully appreciate that economic environment is very necessary for human rights to flower. So in Malaysia, social welfare policies of the last 6 decades have brought human dignity and the graces of life to many who were living on the fringe of existence. However, we do have many problems. And may I now go on to slide 20? I apologize, I have to rush. Otherwise, the chairperson would declare emergency on me. There are many unmet challenges. Along with the chapter on human rights, constitutional supremacy, judicial review, there are powers to combat subversion and emergency, and these powers are overriding. The Constitution did provide some substantive and procedural controls over the use of Article 149 and 150 powers. These controls have not worked well. Next slide. The judiciary has been by far and large conservative. It has not been the bulwark it was intended to be. The chapter on human rights has not been the force it was intended to be. A human rights jurisprudence has not yet taken firm hold. Next slide. There are allegations of selective prosecution. Next slide, slide 23. ineffective check and balance. There is no dearth of institutions, principles, procedures for check and balance so that power checks power. But many of these institutions have not been able to perform their function. They are more political minded, more executive minded than the executive, or there are external impediments. Then there is a problem, next slide, lot of conflict between Sharia and civil courts, and as a result there are some unintended violations of human rights. The Constitution in Schedule 9 lists 2. Paragraph 1 says very clearly, Sharia courts shall have no jurisdiction over persons not professing the religion of Islam. But when Sharia courts dissolve a marriage in which one party is a Hindu and the other had converted to Islam, they dissolve the marriage, they grant custody, a guardianship of the child, and they convert the child, there is clearly a violation of the right of the non-converting spouse. So we are still grappling with this. There have been some positive developments, but still the problem remains. Then I come to the special position of the Malays and the natives of Sabah Sarawak. I want to say this, and perhaps my time is running out. In legal theory, in jurisprudence, affirmative action is fully acknowledged as part of the human rights quest. John Rawls called affirmative action just inequality. In many constitutions, more prominently India, even to some extent in the US constitutional system, though not in the constitution itself, there is provision for affirmative action. In Malaysia, not just for the Malays, but for the natives of Sabah and Sarawak, and for the Orang Asli, there are provisions for affirmative action. However, the problem is this, that Article 153 was clearly surrounded by many safeguards, and those safeguards are either not known, or if known, they have not been enforced. For example, along with the duty to protect the Malays and the natives of Sabah Sarawak, the king is also enjoined to safeguard the legitimate interests of other communities. What is legitimate interest is a glittering generality which I cannot define. But I think from time to time, necessity, politics, expediency, change of circumstances will define it differently from time to time. Number 2, the special position of the Malays applies only in the public sector, not in the private sector. Number 3, it applies in only 4 prescribed areas, not across the board, only in 4 sectors. Licenses and permits, civil service positions, post-secondary education, scholarship, and education facilities. In these sectors, in these 4 sectors, the Yang di-Pertuan may reserve such proportion as may be necessary. So necessity is brought in, or as he may deem reasonable. The word reasonable is brought in. The use of the word proportion implies that monopoly or exclusivity was not contemplated by the Constitution. In the operation of Article 153, the Constitution says no non-Malay or his heir should be deprived of what he has already acquired under the legal system. No business or profession can be exclusively assigned to any race. No ethnic monopoly is permitted. Article 153 does not derogate from Article 136. My slide here shows. What is 136? 136 says no discrimination in the public service. So how do we read 153 and 136 together? Well, Tun Sufyan did it, our former Lord President. He says that entry point quotas are allowed, but once a public servant is in service, there should be no discrimination on the ground of race. Now, sadly, due to lack of constitutional literacy, Article 153 has not been interpreted and enforced in the spirit of affirmative action in which it was framed. This has serious implications for national unity as well as justice and equity for all. And one final point I'll make, I'll just take 1 minute. May I please go on to slide number, sorry. May I go to slide number 28? There are many other areas actually where there are human rights complaints. So there are complaints of inequity. Special rights of Sabah Sarawak were guaranteed. They have not worked so well. Next one, there is inapplicability of international law, which Dr. Denison pointed out. Next slide, Malaysia's political economy, endemic corruption, lack of transparency and accountability. These are problems. Then, of course, there is the issue that there are new frontiers in human rights. Human rights are a journey and not a destination. New and new demands and expectations have arisen, and the felt necessities of the times require new thinking. So, for example, at the horizon, we see, next slide please, at the horizon we see a beckoning of the idea of the rights of future generations. The idea of development and sustainability rights is lapping at our shores, and obviously it links up with the rights of future generations. Poverty eradication is intimately connected with human dignity and human development. Next one, free speech is needed to combat economic vulnerability. An equitable sharing of the benefits and burdens of growth is more likely in a society with freedom of speech and transparency than in an authoritarian setup. There are, of course, new threats emerging. The K economy poses threats to the rights of workers. Cyber information poses problems for right to privacy. Globalization threatens local ownership of indigenous resources. Next one, uncontrolled capitalism. I'm on slide 34. Uncontrolled capitalism is leading to the emergence of private sources of tyranny. Up to now, constitutional law basically was concerned with the tyranny by the state. Now we have to take note of private sources of tyranny. Transnational corporations inflict cross-border violations. Globalization, with all its beauties, has problems. It rejects subsidies, abhors programs of redistributive justice, frowns upon social welfare policies to some extent. There is, of course, the threat of environmental catastrophe, which basically affects the poor. So finally, last point, the human rights movement in the decades ahead in Malaysia must be prepared to rethink human rights, articulate alternative approaches to the dominant concepts, interpretations and practices spawned by mainstream capitalist society, and to formulate a more holistic understanding of human dignity founded upon social justice. And in this area, we all have a role to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Shad, for enlightening us about the national unities from the perspectives of the federal constitutions. And I think it is a very good reminder to all of us that human rights are a journey and not a destination. And we all have a role to play in these issues that concerning the human rights and national unity. So without further ado, I would like to next invite Ms. Serene Lim, the partners and directors of the KRYSS network. Serene is a lawyer with the experience in the human rights work, particularly on gender equality. So over to you, Serene.
Thanks, Dr. Koo. Good afternoon, everyone. So KRYSS Network is an organization that focuses on freedom of expression from a gender lens. And one of the core work that I do is documentations and monitorings of online gender-based violence. And we have also monitored hate against LGBTQ persons and also migrant workers, especially during the pandemics and the severe crackdowns against migrant workers. So I think as a starting point, right, it's important to state that the kind of hate and violence that we observe on the digital space is actually not incidental, it's not spontaneous, it's not a one-off speech, right? It is a structural issue. It is also highly organized, and it is also sponsored and protected by the state. Internet as a space is really diverse. It is really noisy. It is extremely dynamic. Everyone from every single political spectrum is saying something, and that can be a good thing because it contributes to a more vibrant democratic space, especially at a time like this where our mobility is restricted. Many of us have to rethink, how we do our activisms. For instance, these online discussions we have is a way to reimagine, in-person physical forums. We also have to reimagine how we protest. I've seen people mobilizing online protests on social medias, and then I'm very excited about what will happen on Saturday because this is the first protest that we have since I think 1-2 years. That has been so long ago. But I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes being able to say or do something on digital spaces, it doesn't mean that, suddenly we are liberated, suddenly we have power, suddenly we are heard, governments is hearing what we're saying, and we are able to change things, right? What makes all these speeches and actions different from one another is actually the system of verifications that comes with it. For instance, a post that compare LGBTQ persons to an animal will receive validations from Jakims and maybe some professors, from some universities or the state missionaries. Our minister would also agree to that post. Whereas compared to a post by Orang Asli on their land rights, will receive very little support, sometimes maybe even none from MPs or the government. This is where the unequal power really manifests in the digital space, where one group of people is presumed to be supreme than the others, and there is a whole system backing that claims behind this person. And not everybody has equal access to freedom of expressions and meaningful participations on the digital spaces as well. And that ability to freely express ourselves, to freely exercise, to enjoy the benefits of digital space is really closely tied with our identities, our gender, our ethnicities, and the social norms, right? The social norms will decide what can be said in public spaces and what cannot be said. And I think this is where we also need to acknowledge that sometimes recognizing what is hate speech and what is hate speech and violence on the digital space is really not that straightforward because like what Prof said earlier, everybody plays a role in upholding human rights. At the same time, we also play a role in amplifying the harm. And especially in digital space, right, every signal boost contributes to aggregated harm. For instance, right, a person can say, a person can tweet that we should start a war against Rohingya, but that tweet was sometimes actually made in response to a neutral tweet by political leaders that say Rohingya is taking away our jobs. If we look at the legal standards, right, the statements Rohingya is taking away our jobs, it doesn't fall under criminal offense. It's not categorized as hate speech, but the abilities of that tweet to cause harm is real, and it has actually instigated other people to behave a lot more aggressively and violently. And in the workshops that we have done with survivors who have experienced mob attacks at the nationwide levels, right, they also agree that they find it really hard to distinguish what is hate or what is violence on the digital spaces, because every discriminatory post, everything that does not agree with them, that attacks them, even in the absence of any violent or hateful language, could actually lead to potential harm and physical violence towards them. This is where we should really be reminded that not all speech that cause harm or discriminate human rights fall under criminal standards. And the design of algorithms and the business structures of social media really doesn't help too, because these platforms are built to amplify engagements. They encourage interactions, they encourage sharings, and contents like hate, violence, really sensationalized contents are what they thrive on, because this kind of comments attract traffic. And in the age of attention economies, traffic is everything, traffic is money, right? And in one of the research that we have done, we have seen in many cases, right, controversial cases, usually around race or genders, they actually get a lot more traction as compared to a post by a woman with disabilities that is trying to highlight her everyday life. I would also like to bring your attention to a recent case that happened last year. It's a story of a 20 years old woman from the Indian communities. She committed suicide after her TikTok video went viral. The TikTok video features herself and her Nepali co-workers. They were just dancing along to a song, very innocently. They were just having fun. But someone took the TikTok video and posted on Facebook, and many attacked her, and many sent her really abusive language, calling her an easy characters. The case was also reported on several media outlets, but media reported it as cyberbullying, which to me, it fails to look at the different layers of violence and hate here. The first layers is the xenophobic, because the video went viral at a time where there is a nationwide crackdown against migrant workers and refugees. So the aggressions and hate against her was actually compounded by her associations with foreign workers. She's deemed to have brought shame to her communities because she fell in love, which was not true, with migrant workers. And secondly, the attacks against her was also gender-based. People were attacking her identity as an Indian woman because of her age and her ethnicities. She should felt ashamed, for bringing shame to the communities and all that. She also attempted to make a police report, tried to have the video removed, but it was all ignored. So this is where we are also seeing where access to justice is also a class issue, because where she's coming from, she has less ability to access that redress. I think as a closing, when it comes to pressuring governments to uphold human rights, I think it's important for us to pressure the governments to not just amend and repeal laws that hinder human rights, but also to work on strategies that deal with hate speech in a holistic manners, including, to encourage the governments to move away from relying on legal legislations and arrests and to move towards counter speech. And in some cases, we need more speech. We need educations, we need trainings, we need intercultural dialogues and other measures that will contribute to similar outcomes. And I think I really like what Prof said. We are also seeing violations of human rights by transnational companies. And in this case, it's the social media companies, because they are providing the tools and infrastructures where hate and violence are being spread. So they too should be held accountable when it comes to upholding our human rights. That's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serene, for sharing this very important information regarding the hate speech in the digital spaces. I think this is a very important issue that we should also discuss when we talk about human rights and the national unity as well. And here, if you have any question for Serene and Prof. Shad, please do so before they leave the seminar earlier. Yeah, so I have one question here with me for Prof. Prof. Shad, this question is about, what do you think of NEP? Does NEP itself bring more harm than better perspective for all races? Government since then, even during the PH time and now under the PN, are always talking about Bumiputra economic policy. However, this just shows that NEP are not effective to keep the so-called Bumiputra to compete with others' race. What is your view in this, Prof?
Well, NEP is under Article 153, but many of its provisions actually were meant to benefit the entire community of Malaysia, not just Bumiputras. However, it has not always been implemented that way. So my main comment would be this: NEP was part of affirmative action, but in many areas it went too far beyond Article 153. Whether that was because of lack of knowledge of the Constitution, or whether it was because of electoral pressures on the parties, political parties, I think I'll reserve my comment on that. Personally speaking, all in all, Article 153 and NEP can fit under ICERD and other international norms if the benefits of them are to be distributed on the basis of need, so that everyone who is poor, everyone who is needy, everyone who is sick or disabled or aged or the victim of some misfortune is able to benefit. Now, I don't have the actual data. I'm not an economist, but clearly it's obvious that one thing is obvious to me from a human rights point of view, from the equality point of view, is NEP emphasized distribution or redistribution of wealth between the races. But it did not look into distribution of wealth within each race. In other words, the emphasis was so much about non-Malays. Malays have only 5% or 15% or 19%. Non-Malays have so much more. Foreigners have so much. That was the emphasis. That emphasis prevented us from examining whether within a particular race, a small coterie of capitalists were basically monopolizing the wealth or not. That too, I think, is a very important aspect of socio-economic justice. If wealth is to be redistributed, it must be redistributed not only amongst the various communities, within a community, it should not be monopolized by just a few. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. We have one participant who would like to ask a question. I assume William. So while waiting for that, we have another two questions here for Serene, actually. Serene, the first question is, how about private sector participation on gender equality? Government didn't do so much as private sectors are not making such noise on the gender equality. Mistreatments are still in place, and this is a sad situation. Yeah.
So I think actually especially in the context of social media companies and digital platforms, right? Sometimes targeting the private companies are actually a lot more effective because they do care about PR and public optics. Especially right now, there are a lot more awareness on feminism, women's rights issues and all that. And actually Facebook, platforms like Facebook and Google, they have been quite honest about their shortcomings when it comes to online gender-based violence online. So sometimes, actually, I find, collaborating with corporations maybe a step forward for us, especially when it comes to our current governments who actually pay lip service to, gender equality issue.
Thank you, Serene. There's another question. Thank you for your thoughts on online hate speech. You spoke about relying less on the legislation in dealing with it, but I was wondering what is KRYSS Network stance in dealing with it instead? Is there ongoing work finding out what hate speech means to the community that you work with?
Actually, what we are seeing right now when it comes to laws, right? Even though there are laws in Malaysia that would actually protect women and LGBTQ person from all this hate and violence online, but they are not being used. Instead, the laws are just used to, like the organizers for Lawan, 30 of them were investigated. We see how laws are really being abused to really just to keep their powers, and it's really not to, uphold or protect our human rights. And I think in some cases, the lack of gender sensitized or lack of understanding is because we don't have enough conversations on what does it mean to have human rights, what does it mean to, for LGBTQ person to be seen as human, or for orang asli to fully exercise the range of human rights. And I think in order to do that, we need to have honest conversations, and governments need to also actively provide spaces where this form of conversations can happen rather than, just playing their politickings and playing the whole Malay Muslim supremacy card. Yeah. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Serene. I think that reminds to what Prof. Shad just now said, can community morality and the religious prescriptions actually justify the curtailment of some of these human rights issues that we mentioned? Yeah. So I think there's one more question for you, Prof. After 64 years, is it time, or when will it be the time for race differentiations to be removed from the Constitution?
Well, the Constitution does not provide a time limit, but the removal of such distinctions is certainly possible. May I just look at the Perlembagaan? For example, Article 38 of the Constitution dealing with the Conference of Rulers says in one place, 38 clause 2, 38 clause 5, the Conference of Rulers shall be consulted before any change in policy affecting administrative action under Article 153 is made. In other words, change in policies are contemplated by the Constitution. And I did try to point out to you earlier, the Constitution does use words like whatever is necessary, reasonable, proportion. So I think Article 153 is not written in granite. While it is difficult to amend, it will require 2/3 majority plus the consent of Conference of Rulers. It is amendable, and administrative policies under it. I know for a fact, I'm sure you know, from time to time, actually, the government has varied, modified. I know at one time during Tun Mahathir's premiership, he said that the universities will take in students on merit. During Datuk Sri Najib's time, at one time it was said the 30% equity requirement in some sectors will be removed or dropped. So in answer to your question, I can't really give you the time limit. This is for politicians, and I certainly hope, I can just express my hope that in the years to come, less and less identification with race and religion. It should be identification with the nation. But everyone who is poor, everyone who is needy, who is marginalized should be given assistance. 153 encompasses that legitimate interests of all other communities.
Thank you, Prof. Let's take this last question since due to the time limit. Do we need national reconciliation, which including Sabah and Sarawak, to put Malaysia back on track regarding human rights and tolerance between races? Prof? Hi, Prof. Can you hear? I think we lost Prof for a while, yeah? For Eng Zeng, we will answer the questions for the open discussions, yeah, for Dr. Denison due to the time constraint. Let us now move on to Dr. Wan Puspa Melati first. Dr. Wan Puspa Melati is from the Faculty of Social Sciences and Leisure Management with the Taylor's Universities. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koo. I'll be sharing my screen. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Koo, as well as the organizer for having me today. 10 minutes, so I will definitely just jump right in. So, you know, that the previous speakers, Dr. Denison, Prof. Shad, Ms. Serene have spoken quite extensively, linking the human rights and national unity. And with this 10 minutes, I would like to focus a little bit more on national unity and, you know, moving forward, you know, what can we do to move forward? So before I start with some thoughts, I would like to share a little bit of personal anecdotes, right? Because when we talk about national unity, you know, and we talk about racism, talk about discrimination, so just some thoughts and some stories that I just wanted to highlight. When I was younger, when I was in school, I mean, don't get me wrong, I had really good time in school. But I used to have these two teachers that really stood out when I talk about racism and unity. So one of them was my Bahasa Malaysia teacher. So she was, in class, she would always pose really difficult question for Bahasa Malaysia class. And she would always put the Malay students on the spot. And obviously, some of us, including myself, we sometimes are not able to answer those questions because those are really tough questions, at least for us. And she would always make this comment to say that, see, even Malay students can't answer this. And she would go on and say that, if Malay students score well in my class, I'm not that surprised because that's your mother tongue language. But if non-Malays scores well, that is when I'm very elated and I get really excited. So that was one anecdote. Another one was my religious instructor. So I used to have this one Ustazah. She's fun-loving, funny person out of class. But in class, somehow when she educates us, she would oftentimes make all these passing remarks about non-Malays and non-Muslims, and sometimes even make certain association. For example, using the word things like haram, or making fun of other culture or races on the things that they eat, for example. So those are the things that sometimes really get me thinking. I have friends. Again, these are some acquaintances. I send my children to Chinese school. They'll come to me and say, "What are you doing? Don't you pity your children? What are you trying to do to the child? Sending them to SIJKC." And I even have extended family members, thankfully extended slightly further, who would always racialize everything. They would talk about, for example, if I'm late, get stuck in traffic, there was an accident, they will ask, which race is it? I used to volunteer in an abuse shelter. So one of the things that they say is this particular race, because this particular race is associated to abuse stereotype. Now, my point highlighting this is I'm sure that most of us would experience this on over time as we grow older. And it's definitely not uniquely to me, just as a Malay or just as a Muslim. But I have the support system. My father is a trained sociologist, so I could always go back and have this conversation, which I thought was a weird conversation. I can go back and he could sort of clear my thoughts and putting me back on track and really highlighting the fact that, prejudice is not right. Discrimination should not be it under any circumstances, things like that. But I'm not sure whether or not this is the kind of thing that other people have the ability to have this kind of discussion with other people, for example. So with that lens, what I'll be talking about a little bit is more at the micro level. So what all this, the previous speakers have spoken about more at the macro level. So I just wanted to share some thoughts. So I thought, yay, when earlier this year, the National Unity Plan was published. And, they had really, really good strategic plans in there. A lot of issues that are highlighted are obviously in line with human rights. And we are talking about trying to closing the gap, trying to ensure that everybody have equal access. And then one of my personal favorite is empowering the social mediators in communities. I truly believe in that, so I think they have outlined a lot of really good things there. And I was also quite excited to see that they have hashtags, trying to appeal to the younger population. Perpaduan adalah suatu kebiasaan, So this is, I thought this is great. It's just that after reading through this and having some discussion with younger population, including my students, in fact, coming onto this talk, I have had some conversations with younger people, just really trying to get a kind of sentiment, not representative in any way, but just to get some sentiment and just to talk a little bit about it. So I just wanted to highlight four main points. The first one is when we talk about unity, so we are talking about unity as a Malaysian. So the idea of the national identity, trying to ensure that people have this patriotism, compassion, tolerance, respect, collective responsibility, great. This is exactly what we need, right? I mean, at least on paper, ideology-wise, it's really good. But the current sentiment that when I was talking to some of the younger people, we oftentimes, the question is of, what are we proud of now? As a Malaysian, what is it? So currently with the current political state condition, instability, the economic status right now, the current pandemic, the effect on education, the effect on work, and people start questioning this. And I guess the fundamental thing that we definitely have to do is to really think, like, what is it mean for us to be Malaysian, and how are we going to really emulate this and really be proud to be a Malaysian, right? So that is the main question. And what happens is, even in the National Unity Plan, they talk about educating, highlighting history, the Constitution, the Rukun Negara. I think that's great. That really brings us to the root. But how this is delivered, you've seen Prof. Shad. His followers would know Prof. Shad does this amazingly. I have never been privileged enough to have him as my lecturer or educator before this, but lately I have been following his talks, and he has done some talks for College University, and it's brilliant. So what people want to know is, how, as a Malaysian, regardless of which segment of population you are, how do you relate to that history of ours? How do we relate to the Constitution or the Rukun Negara? So it is not just understanding those texts, but what it really means to you. Only then people would have that kind of being proud to be Malaysian, right? And hence the identity could be created. We would not want people to come together as a form of unity, but with a common enemy. What happened during election, for example. So you want people to come together as Malaysian, be proud to be Malaysian. My second point is on socializing agents. Now, this is nothing new. In fact, in the National Unity Plan, also, there's a small part where they talk about the role of proses sosialisasi, the socialization process. Now, we know and how it felt like reading the National Unity Plan, they highlighted the role of this holistic system where you have the government, the educators, the parents, community leaders, everybody come together, to ensure that our plan works for national unity. But we know that socializing agents plays a very important role as role models. So, for example, if we want, we hope that the government will be effective socializing agents, then, people are questioning, are they themselves showing good role models to show that patriotism, compassion, tolerance, respect, collective responsibility, are they displaying this, And some of the young people are also saying that, socializing takes two ways, right? So where they could socialize the young people, but the young people is also socializing them. When they, Serene talk about voicing out, having platforms, so to what extent are they taking in and not jump on it, and taking it constructively and working around it. And then we have the role of educators. A lot of the plan that has been rolled out has really good plans about what educators can do to further promote this. You have all these additional module, cross-cultural, for example, to increase the inter-ethnic relationships, for example. These are great. But what about the educators themselves? Are they able to manage the students, especially in terms of how they do social inclusion, right? So, for example, if there's an inter-ethnic kind of clash in a classroom, how do they do this? How do they manage this? Or if they have students who are not able to work with different groups, how do they manage this? I think this should not be sidelined in the process. So it's not just getting the educators to be trained or skilled, choosing the cream of the crop, because that in itself doesn't translate into being able to have that interpersonal intelligence, and also case conferencing, how to manage those issues. right? And then community leaders, as I mentioned, this is great, having these rukun tetangga, community mediators, because this is where we could really enforce unity within the community. I think this is great. But again, we have seen over the years, we have these community mediators, but sometimes this is also politicized. So when certain people are in charge, maybe less budget or maybe less activity, that these community leaders, their activities, their case conferences, their upskill of their training, those are stopped. So these community leaders also needed a kind of support in order for them to engage well in the community, because we know that if engagement in the community, if people are not ready, that could even have a more detrimental effect. They're not helping at all sometimes. And what I thought was interesting is that in terms of parents, so the parents is highlighted to be part of the system, and yet it is encouraged to be part of the system, but there's no institutionalized way of really training these parents to be able to play their role well as a socializing agents. Two last quick points. I just want to highlight another one. The third point is unity as an organic process. So what we have on paper sometimes could be seen as really mechanical. This is what you do. This could be the outcome. But it is more than that, So perhaps what is needed really is not so much of giving them the theory. That could be one. So I saw some of the suggested activity, for example, you can name the food of another culture, for example. Sure, that becomes a one of the ways of doing it, but we have to live it, right? So for example, we need to get the students to help one another so that they know somebody of another race, they could count on somebody of another race. So maybe the pembimbing rakan sebaya, instead of just helping the teachers to carry the books or conducting activities, they could really play their role, sort of like a mediator within the school system. Or we can do sort of like the exchange student kind of program. Like sometimes you have like students from Japan come to Malaysia, they can stay with a Malaysian family, learning the culture, really living it. We could very well do that with the different races, different cultures. So it's an immersive kind of learning rather than theoretical kind of concept. My last point is this: young Malaysians want to be involved, definitely, but this is sometimes a bit confusing. You want to be involved, and we encourage young people to be critical, to participate, to use ICT. We have that even leadership role, and yet when they try to highlight certain things, what they consider as not right or unethical, and they do it on social media, for example, and then they get into trouble. They get questioned, they get arrested, because of what they're trying to do on a social media platform. So whose standard of media ethics are we following? So these are among the things that I just wanted to highlight, and that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wan Puspa Melati, for sharing your views from the micro lens. And I think one of the things that is important for us to perhaps later on discuss is about the implementations of the National Unity Plan as well, that between the 2021 until 2030. So I think we have the questions for Dr. Shad, Prof. Shad. Unfortunately, he has left the seminar, so I will reserve the questions for the other speakers later, yeah? And without further ado, I will invite Mr. Jerald Joseph, the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia's commissioners, to provide his presentation. Jerald?
Good afternoon. Hi, Dr. Ying Hui. Good to see you. Thank you to KSI, to Tan Sri, to Dr. Denison, and PROHAM for inviting and organizing this event. I think I will just focus a little bit on the part about looking at Malaysia's international commitment on this front of international standards on racial discrimination. I think I will just go into the 20 years ago, there was this World Conference Against Racism, and Malaysia, all governments participated. Last minute, Israel and US walked out, but it was still a global conference, a third world conference. And I was involved in the process from the NGO point of view at the International Steering Committee. It was an exciting event because racism brings up so much of emotions and energy. So I think it was a powerful coming together. Not everybody agreed to everything, but maybe I'll just share some photos to put in context some of the images. I don't think I can ever be as articulate as Professor Shad Faruqi, so I will bluff by putting more photographs, right? Yeah. So these are some of the people coming together to assert, and the title was the World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. After almost about 8 days together, they came up with a declaration called the DDPA. So this was people coming from African descent, from minorities, from different countries, trying to ask their space. This was intersectionality of women and gender telling their stories. So you could see the T-shirt. So on the ground, people were joining across the continent, picking up issue on interest. And so the issue ranged from even land rights, reparation, slavery, minority, majority, caste-based discrimination. So this is one, the Indian community and the South Asian community organized themselves very well to push the case of racism. Caste discrimination is racism. And they were pushing for this one, paragraph 73. But, you know, the document of the UN was very cruel. It finally took out almost all words that linked to caste-based discrimination. This was them. So this was, it looked like it was a big party. There were 7,000 NGOs there next to the government Durban. We were in Durban, right? So this time, at this point, Aung San Suu Kyi was not free. Well, she's not free again now, so maybe it's a relevant photograph now. She's detained again, yeah. Tibet, so you realize how political it is because China, India, all the big players were not happy. US was not happy. Israel was not happy. Every government was not happy. I even got scolded by the Malaysian ambassador then in Iran for bringing up about Malaysian minority, ethno-majoritarian issue. That one line we put in his statement, he was so angry with me. He was friendly in the beginning. At the end of the conference, it became a bit unfriendly. And I'm not used to Malaysians being unfriendly overseas, so I was a bit shocked, yeah. So this is the minorities in Japan, the Ainu, so the Palestinian were really fighting hard. The Jewish community were fighting on the Holocaust. So this is very interesting. There's a Jewish human rights network that was fighting for end of Zionism and for Palestine. This was a workshop that was being organized. Every workshop either by the Jewish network or the Palestinian, after 15 minutes, it will collapse because everybody will be shouting and getting very emotional. This was real. Huh? This is still real. This was us trying to get some forgotten issues. That's a lady from Tibet with me, the Nepali, and a few groups. We had big gatherings. This was us being addressed by Fidel Castro. So this was in the forum, formal panel. So I think that gives you a capture of how much of energy was put in to this. And 20 years down the line, there's a reaffirmation today. And my point was, Malaysian government was part of the process and we were party to that final declaration called the DDPA, Durban Declaration and Program Action. It's a long document, 222 pages. You can find almost all good ideas to solve racism in the world, but I'm not sure how much of it is undertaken to be followed through in our countries. So after 7 days, the government signed on this thick document, and it was improvement from the last two world conferences. There hasn't been any world conference on racism since 20 years ago. Because this world conference also addressed the issue of xenophobia and related intolerance. So they expanded the scope. So it was quite a comprehensive action plan to eradicate racism. It also had issues on the Palestinian struggle, reparation, caste discrimination. So it picked up everybody's issue. So after all that big fight, political big fight in Durban, or leading up to Durban, I think very few governments have taken interest in following through that DDPA, including Malaysia. So I was very happy to see that in 19 November 2020, the General Assembly of the UN had a resolution titled "A Global Call for Concrete Action for the Elimination of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, and the comprehensive implementation on the follow-up to the Durban Declaration Program of Action." Why are we pointing this out to you? Because Malaysia was one of the 106 states, governments that voted in favor of the resolution. So I'm very proud that Malaysia voted in favor, which means we are serious about tackling this. So we must congratulate our government for signing on, for saying yes to this, but now it's time to take action. And what does the resolution speak about? The resolution actually is quite an important resolution because it says, first, it recalls, it picks up from a 20-year-old document and reaffirms. It recalls the suffering of victims of racism, racial discrimination. In Malaysia, it's time we need to call out who are the victims, who are victimized by racism in the country. I think we saw the constitutional framework to balance rights, but in reality, it's not. There are people who suffer this. It could be from school children waiting to get into university after getting 10, 11, 12 years and still cannot make it because of a different ethnic group. Number two, this resolution calls on the important outcome of the World Conference should be an important document that all should believe. So Malaysia agrees that it's an important document. It agrees that it's a solid basis for comprehensive measures for combating racism. It also agrees that there is an increase in hate speech considering incitement to racial discrimination. It also agrees, these are points from the resolution, so when the government signs on to it, that means it agrees, yeah? Various racist extremist movements based on ideologies that seek to promote nationalist right-wing agendas and racial superiorities is happening in the world. So in Malaysia, it is happening and we must put a stop to it and call out to these groups. We need to promote inclusion, diversity, tolerance for civilizations. Also, to be concerned about political leaders and parties who support such an environment, toxic environment. So I think it agrees that despite efforts in this regard, millions of human beings continue to be victims of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, which means that we still have a long way to go. It recognizes racism has a deep negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights. I think this is the framework of our discussion today on the human rights broadly. If without tackling racism, it will also impact other rights that people want. It could be economic rights, social rights, political rights, Yeah. So I think it's a reaffirmation of human rights. It also calls on specifically that any doctrine of racial superiority is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust and dangerous, and must be rejected together with theories that attempt to determine the existence of human races. So I think if the government can agree internationally, then Malaysia, we must make our work more serious to end racial superiority doctrine, to end separation of two type levels of citizenship, the majority having one type of sets of rights or so-called perceived rights, and then the non-majority having something that they have to follow through in expecting, right? And human rights can only work if it's a right across the board for all. Immaterial majority, minority, immaterial Bumiputra, non-Bumiputra, immaterial what ethnic group you are. And I think if any government really wants to take up this issue of racism, the first step is to acknowledge that we are seriously flawed in attempting to manage race relations in Malaysia because there is non-recognition, lack of honesty on the framework that is been the political bedrock of Malaysia that thrives on racism as its premium. And I'm really happy that we have this document that the Malaysian government agrees with many other governments. And I tell you, the reason I'm happy is because there are very powerful governments that didn't agree with this, with Malaysia and the 106. 44 were abstention and 14 states voted against it. If I remember right, US and I think Canada, Israel voted against it. So maybe it is time we stand proud, but let's stand proud by doing our serious work back home to bring back equality and inclusion in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerald, for sharing your views. And I think that this is precisely why we are having these online conversations, that, you know, our government has committed itself to many promises internationally. However, domestically, we know there are serious flaws that we need to fix. I think this is especially so when we talk about the Durban Declaration and the program of actions that we have signed and committed as well. So without further ado, next, I would like to invite Dr. Ryan Chua, the Program Director of the Pusat KOMAS, to give us his presentation. Ryan?
All right. Thanks, Ying Hui, for the introduction. And I think the speakers before me have already shared a lot with regards to the macro level, micro level, the federal constitution. But I'm just trying to give a short way on how we can really find a way forward, especially in our work here. So just a brief introduction of what KOMAS is. KOMAS is a human rights organization. I mean, we are located in PJ, but we work to promote national unity. We work to eliminate all issues and all forms of racial discrimination, if there's any, and that's our core work here in KOMAS. So when we speak with regards to issues of national unity and in terms of racism and racial discrimination, I think we need to first take an idea of what are some of the initiatives that have already been taken by the current federal government. And I think some of these efforts are commendable. Some of these ways could actually have really shown that, you know, the government has certain intention of wanting to do something. So if you can see from this whole timeline that I'm sharing with all of you, you know, we started off in 2013. I think here we have Tan Sri, Michael Yeoh, and we have Dr. Denison, who are all part of the National Unity Consultative Council, which was established in 2013. And then, of course, throughout the whole period, I think there were also a lot of discussion on whether the document or the recommendations that come from the NUCC can be published and can be shared with the general public, but it was all kept and hidden under the Official Secrets Act. It was only until in 2018, during the Pakatan Harapan government's time, that this document and the blueprint was actually released to the public. And at that point of time, also the Harapan government has also then decided that, you know, let's try to find measures. Let's see what we can do in terms of rectifying ISA. But of course, it came back with huge backlashes, which I think was perfectly captured by Dr. Denison in his whole documentation that he has shared with us earlier. Then, of course, there were also efforts and certain recommendations from the NUCC blueprint, such as the National Harmony and Reconciliation Bill. There were also talks in terms of forming a commission specifically to help mediate such issues. But of course, it was all discontinued after the change of government. It was all ideas, but it was all discontinued in 2020. And then, of course, in 2020, when the new government have taken place, they've established a ministry, and I believe some of you, some of the panelists themselves are also part of the National Unity Advisory Council, NPPN. So again, this is a new initiative, and every time when there's a new government who has come forth, we have a new set of advisors, we have a new set of advisory council. And again, you know, what has transpired in all of this, we have yet to see. And of course, in 2021, at the beginning of the year, we have seen that the government has launched a National Unity Blueprint, which tried to aim in terms of 2021 to 2023 to what are our Malaysia strategic point that they have to take in order to promote national unity in the country. So when we take this in a nutshell, it comes to the question of what then are the effectiveness of such policies, such ideas, such initiatives to try to eradicate the issue of racism and racial discrimination in Malaysia. And until today, we still see ineffective laws to curb hate speech are still in place, which some of them, as you can see, you know, we have the Communications and Multimedia Act and much more. And of course, we had the Sedition Act, which is a big issue that we really need to think about on how to really address such things. And then we have indiscriminate continuation of policies favoring of one ethnic over the other. And I think some of you have also raised questions about the NEP. What is happening about that? What do we do about it? And then of course, issues of racism and racial discrimination are still prevalent in our society today. And this is based on KOMAS documentation of such issues in our Malaysia Racial Discrimination Report from 2015 to 2020. So again, you can see that there were also trends within this report, and which we also highlighted that the whole heightened racial tension that we see during this whole period is during the Harapan government's governance. And as you can see, also it's also played very largely by political parties. And then when it comes to the PN government, and then we hear talks of let's try to reconcile, let's try to put our differences behind. And then of course we have discussion and engagement on national unity at the grassroots level have not touched on critical issues related to racial equality. And this is also another big issue that we have to speak about, because oftentimes there are efforts to try to capture moments of unity. And I think Dr. Denison and the others have also heard me have mentioning about all this, having initiatives, having events to bring people from different ethnic groups, different races together, trying to foster those moments. But oftentimes those moments are just mere moments. We don't have the critical engagement points to really discuss, trying to build understanding, trying to build not what we call as tolerance, but trying to understand a little bit more about other races and other ethnicities in the country. And this is something that we really need to take a retrospective approach in looking at it, because having such moments, though great and nice in general, but really, how much does it really help promote racial equality? How much do we really promote racial and intercultural understanding? So now moving on to the National Unity Action Blueprint, I think Dr. Wan Puspa has also mentioned earlier about the NU National Unity Action Plan as one of new ways or of good positive step. But again, we have certain reservations with regards to the National Unity Action Plan, and I think this was also highlighted before to the government. But again, some of the key few points that I wanted to highlight here is also a step is the National Unity Action Plan is a step forward, as I do agree with many, but certain reservations must be weighed in before another idea takes the form of paperwork instead of a solid execution. We have many NUCC, we have many initiatives at the NUCC and much more. We have excellent ideas, but then again, how then do we put forward? How then do we make into and execute those ideas? And I think that's the biggest question that we have. For example, we have the National Human Rights Action Plan, which was created a few years in 2018, a few years ago in 2018, but we still don't see any tangible outcomes. We don't see any solid execution with regards to those action plan. And again, it's an irony coming from the Perikatan National Government, who has been trying to promote national unity, that they are promoting national unity while they have been on the stance saying that we are portraying themselves as a Malay Muslim government for all. So again, it's an irony, it's an insincere way and move. It has race and religion has been used as a political tool for them to push them to what they are today. And then now they are saying that we need to talk about national unity. So it's a little bit hypocritical. But this is something that we need to question. And one of the important things that we need to touch on is also in terms of the Grun norms. Some of the key ideas were actually made on selected provisions in the federal constitution, which reinforces the rights or certain provisions or certain ways to enforce the majority ethnic worldviews. So there are no balancing acts. There are small balancing acts, but it does not take into consideration Article 8, which promotes equality. It speaks a lot about 153. It speaks about Islam in some of the articles, which sets the Grun norms of this new national unity blueprint. So it's slightly weighted towards one specific majority race without taking into consideration the other minority groups that are here in Malaysia. So then we talk in terms of the credibility of the implementers. I think this is something which Dr. Wan Puspa has mentioned as well. The educators, the people who are going to implement some of the initiatives from the National Unity Blueprint is also questionable. And of course, one of the biggest issues that we have is also the inability of the National Unity Action Plan to recognize ongoing racism and racial discrimination. And this is something which I think we need to really take offense to, or not really offense, but a serious concern, because if they do not recognize the yearnings of the oppressed groups, then it clearly shows that they do not have the political will, or there's no vision that such injustices must be rooted out. And I think this is something really troubling about the National Unity Action Blueprint. It's good in paper, but you don't even recognize issues of racism and racial discrimination. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed as well. And we have several initiatives. You have the inter-ethnic studies. We have so many other like civic education. But again, the idea is always to come out new modules to promote inter-ethnic relationship, but what are its effectiveness? I have friends who have gone through the inter-ethnic modules, and for them it's just a past subject. I just need to pass it. I'm just doing it for the sake of doing it. So again, what then are the effectiveness? We have so many education, we have so many modules, but really the effectiveness is not measured, and it's really most of the time is not doing much in terms of addressing such issues. So what then do we as Malaysians, NGOs and civil societies need to do to address this? And I think a holistic approach versus a top-down approach needs to be employed. Again, from the ICET incident, even though we have the executives already willing to do something in terms of implementing certain policies and laws, but when the people on the ground are not aware, they are still not ready, then we will have an issue. So we need a holistic approach. We have to approach it from the top down, and also from the top, and also from the bottom approach. So we need to hold such conversations with the people on the ground. Again, then and this approach needs to help us in terms of dismantling certain policies which already promote racial discrimination, and also then try to come up with ideas to introduce policies which promotes equal opportunities. So I just want to take two examples here, that some of the things that we have done here in KOMAS, because we have approached state and state governments. Because oftentimes federal government, we have tried to approach, they will give you a lot. Until now, unfortunately, the National Unity Ministry has yet to want to meet us to have a discussion, and this is alarming. We have come up with several proposal papers, and then they are talking about wanting to promote national unity, but they do not even recognize or acknowledge all of us. So this is a big issue. But then again, what we have done here in KOMAS is that we have engaged state governments and agencies. So one of the efforts that we have done in the Penang state government was to come up with a code of conduct for the promotion of equal opportunities in the business sector. And oftentimes when we speak about issues of racism, we also need to explore and acknowledge that even the majority themselves, the Malay Muslim communities themselves, are also discriminated. And I think that's one of the biggest flaws, that oftentimes when people come up to speak about the issues of the minorities, we tend to forget about the plights and the injustices that were also experienced by the majority. And this is where I'm saying that, we need to have a balancing act, certain code of conduct, certain policies which acknowledges the different levels of discrimination that have been experienced by both sides, and come up with what we call as an equal opportunity and equal policy for all. And another one policy that we are working on with the Selangor state government is also in terms of coming up with a code of ethics to really address issues of hate speech using the Rabab Action Plan. So you have 6 thresholds for us to identify what exactly constitutes hate speech. So these are some initiatives, and that is where it moves on to the recognition that politicians themselves fan racial sentiments. So we as the voters, we have to tell them, look, you are not a politician for only a particular race or ethnic group. And of course, media literacy for practitioners and consumers. Again, media plays a very important role in terms of conveying certain messages, like what Dr. Wan Puspa has mentioned. We have multiple levels on how we can convey such messages. So again, then we need to educate people that, you have to be careful when you consume certain information. And lastly, we need to bring the conversation to the ground level. And oftentimes we have been speaking to the converted. And what I mean by the converted is those who are already privy and aware of such issues, but have we actually take the step to really speak to those who are what we call as unconverted here? Are they aware of such issues? So I think that sums up in a nutshell. I actually saw some of the questions about Malaysianness and all that kind of stuff, which I think I will be more than happy to share during the open discussion later. But these are just some of the key points that I have to share with all of you, and I'll be more than happy to answer more questions during the open discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan, for sharing your views with us. And I think Ryan has highlighted that the issues of legislations and the policies as well. Sometimes when we look at it, we have quite a number of policies that are being put in place. Nevertheless, the issues remains there. And I think the other points that raised by Ryan is that documents on the National Human Rights Action Plan that has been there, but however, there's very little talk about it and what the government is doing with that big documents. I think with this, we have listened to the 6 panelists in our panel discussions, and now let's move on to the questions and answer. I have received a few questions here. The first question just now by Eng Zeng. This is a question for Dr. Denison as well as Dr. Wan as well. As mentioned, unfortunately, Prof. Shad has left the webinar for another engagement. So this question is basically referred to different mastery of languages leads to different cultural points of reference and interpretations of the national identity. Same thing will also happen to human rights. So Malaysia, despite of this peaceful history, deep down it is still fragmented, where narratives are dissonant between the different races, as if each races are living in different parallel cultural worlds. So to Dr. Denison and Dr. Wan Puspa, do you think we should configure ourselves a Malaysian conceptions of human rights, one that links closely to further nation building, rather than preserving the current constitutional arrangement that delays the problem rather than solving it head on? Can I pass to Dr. Denison first?
Okay, I think the area of language and interpretation is one aspect. Language and identity is another, where it could be linked to ethnicity or to a particular community that seeks its identity, like the Jewish community, or more recently the Dravidian Indian Tamil identity because of language. But in terms of constitution or human rights, there are certain set of normatives that have been accepted at a global level, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a regional or subnational or Western document. It's a document that is accepted in the post-Second World War by the United Nations. And it becomes, while it's a declaration, it becomes the basis upon which all the conventions and other declarations are built upon. So while people have relativist ideas or want to have regional focal points, it cannot move away from the minimum normative standards that are set in the UDHR. There is the European Human Rights Declaration. There are people calling on the Cairo Declaration or the Islamic or the ASEAN Declaration. But all the other declarations are then tested on the basis of the UDHR and the Universal Declarations. Of course, individuals can interpret it differently, but there is a whole stream of knowledge and context in which it has to be put within that context, like the federal constitution. I think the way Shad Faruqi has brought the constitution alive is not how many other law lecturers in public universities have highlighted it. So there is often this call that Malaysia should have its own human rights framework, which is cultural and acceptable and so forth. And to that, I would say that Parliament acknowledged the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the basic standard for Malaysia, as long as it is consistent with the federal constitution. And that was passed by the Parliament and so forth. So I would then reaffirm that there are in the convention, which is then legally binding document. Malaysia signed CEDAW, Malaysian signed the CRC, Malaysian signed the Disability Convention. And so it's binding to its implementation, it's held accountable to the treaty bodies and so forth. So while we can say we might have peculiar aspects, there is a global minimum standards to which, you cannot shoot a surrendered soldier. There are certain standards. So the Federal Constitution in its fundamental liberties is a very much human rights document that's built on the knowledge of international law that's been there. So I'm not, so the issue of identity and languages, it's important. And in the morning lecture that Professor Shad highlighted, he took Article 152 of the Federal Constitution, where he said federal and state funds can be utilized for the promotion, study of other languages, which often is not undertaken by federal government and state governments. So even community languages, other languages, the Constitution envisage diversity of use of languages, but there has to be a common identity, and the human rights identity is a collective one. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Denison. Dr. Wan, Puspa, maybe we can answer that questions on the language together with the other questions about the school systems. Are there enough initiatives happening in the school system when it comes to eliminating the racial discriminations?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. And yes, I totally agree with Prof. Dr. Denison. So just touching on a little bit about the language. It is also interesting that you're right. Language is important. It is one of the binding forces, so to speak. In fact, I also would like to highlight that language, for example, sign language in Malaysia. I've been working quite a bit with the deaf community, and it is interesting that even for them, really trying to get the Bahasa Isyarat Malaysia, which is the BIM, as the formal language that should be used, even in a school system, and really trying to get people to be even more sensitized towards sign language, for example, because they themselves feel sometimes neglected just because of this language barrier. So to me, language is really, really important, and the National Unity Plan have also highlighted this, that they would also encourage people to have that two main languages, Bahasa Malaysia and then English, and then to encourage to take a third language, for example. But I feel that sometimes language it's a bit more than just speaking it, right? So language has a lot of culture to it. So, when, for example, when my first anecdote earlier on, where people were asking me, why do I send my son to a Chinese school? They say, why do you send to a Kebangsaan school? And then you just send him to a Chinese language class, but it's a different ballgame altogether. It's not just a spoken language, but how the language, the culture that comes to it, with it matters. So I agree that I think ideally speaking, all of us should be able to speak not just 2 or 3, like multiple languages, so that we could communicate, including sign language, so that we could at least have that basis to connect to one another. It's so interesting that whenever we meet somebody and then somebody could speak our native language, and we get really excited, and then that in itself create that kind of oneness, right? So yes, I truly agree with that too. Language is really important and definitely serve as a basis. Another question that was asked just now, whether or not there's a frank conversation, unity, respect, and discrimination. Like in the school now, just because maybe I still look young, but I left at school for quite some time now. So I guess even if now, especially in a private institution, for example, I believe that we should be able to see some form of improvement in terms of people having more conversations on this. But my point still holds. It has to be organic. it is not just a conversation, because we can say as much as, just like how my non-Malay friends who told me about pendidikan moral, they have to memorize 120 nilai-nilai murni, and they memorize it, they get an A for that. Dr. Ryan talks about learning hubungan ethnic and getting a pass to it. But we don't internalize it. Why? Because how the module is as such, how the conversations are taking place. What we really have to do is this living it experience. I cannot emphasize that enough. That means we have to do it. We have to be in contact. We have to do engagement. So one of the strategic plan that was laid out, for example, in the National Unity Plan, was that to have more maybe competitions, sports, for example, to increase these interracial relationships or increase engagement. But the engagement has to be not in a competitive manner. When you have a competition and then you have one team of one race, for example, that kind of interaction is not a healthy one. In fact, it might cause even more issues between members of different race, for example, unless you have a sporting event, but you have criteria. Each group must have members of different races, for example, then that might be a different thing. So I still feel that conversation is one, but we have to live it. So we stay over at a friend's house. We do that anak angkat system thing. I still really think that would be really interesting. You get, a Malay family have 1 week an Indian person, an Indian child stay at home, Malay person stay Chinese. So, that kind of thing, to live it. So I think that is more important. This is what we need so that we truly internalize it. We truly have a good relationship. It is not just a matter of conversation and it stops there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wan. We have a few more questions here. These questions is actually to Dr. Shad, but I would like to invite perhaps Jerald on this. Do we need national reconciliation, which includes Sabah and Sarawak, to put Malaysia back on track regarding human rights and tolerance between races?
Thank you. I think, sorry. Hi. Well, this question is presupposes that national reconciliation definitely must include Sabah and Sarawak. It's a given. But it's, if we are going to use a human rights framework, then again, it must be one standard working for all. Includes the Orang Asli, includes different regions like Sabah and Sarawak, which have a special status. It must include the minority community. It cannot just include the majority Malays or the majority Muslims. I think the background framework for national reconciliation, it cannot be you try to maneuver reconciliation without addressing the serious fault lines that has been embedded in the rights framework of Malaysia. And that then will call on the question of that the majority and minority is spoken about as Malay, non-Malay, or Muslim, non-Muslim. So already we have a binary way of looking at Malaysia, and that shouldn't be. It should be a Malaysian identity. But even if that is contested, then even your talk about language, even the people who learn Malay as their first language in all the schools, they are not fighting for being Malaysian. They are fighting for still ethnic identities. And so I find it strange that we want to look at language as to call out who is more Malaysian than less. But the question is that, does one understand that if you're a Malaysian, then you will defend the human rights of all Malaysians? Of course, we'll have to talk about all in Malaysia, but I'm just talking about the equality concept of citizenship. I think without that, I think Malaysia, after almost 70 years, I think someone already mentioned about do you use punitive measures or softer measures? I think it's a mix of both. We've been doing a lot of awareness, a lot of pictures to bring people together, but I think it is time to call out hate speech by law that incites racism. It is time to call on members of parliament who use race-based speeches to get support. It is time for us to speak again about affirmative action for those who need it on needs-based and not on race-based. I think that moment has passed because there's so many respected and successful Malay community who has come through the years, and Malaysia cannot wait until the project is fully completed. It will never be fully completed. No country is fully perfect or completed. So that's why I really don't think we should have the notion that we want to remedy and redo again NEP. I think NEP had its very sincere moment in Malaysia's history to bridge the gap, but that is over now. It's being exploited, and we just need a merit-based affirmative action that will then address whoever is in the majority. If the majority is Sabah, Sarawak, Orang Asli, Malays, they will get the help needed, and it doesn't matter who needs the help. So I think this kind of courage in Malaysia needs to be spoken about. And also, my final point, maybe I know because time is also tight, is that there probably is going to be very slow movement for change if we have the notion that the only way we can move forward is by getting more enlightened Malays to lead the charge for racism, to fight racism. I think that's a flaw, because the fight for racism actually is on the people who are impacted by racism. That is what Black Lives Matter mean. The Black lives in US who feel dejected or inferior are the ones leading the charge for change. Everybody else joins that struggle. That's fine. Everybody joins the struggle, including in South Africa. The fight for apartheid was led by the South Africans who were jailed, who had second-class citizenship, but then everyone joined in, the enlightened Africans, the whites, the global community. So this is how our fight in Malaysia is going to be. The voices of the people who are victims of racism must speak up, and all other Malaysians who feel Malaysia, it is an unfair level playing field, because the constitutional provision was designed to make it for all Malaysians to move forward. You and I must speak up, without which I think we will be a very old and long waiting for only the elites to bring us forward, and that's been really ineffective. Look at Malaysia where we are. The elites, political elites, have played us out. They play to the gallery, they play with sentiments, and it has been a dangerous game that has been happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerald. Actually, you just touched on another question, just very quick one to get your views about the NEP actually. So the suggestion was that I think the solution to this unity is to bring about a fast track to of a balanced financial income rakyat. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what I was mentioning. A needs-based approach. I agree with the person who mentioned this. Yeah, so it's fine to be called NEP, but let's go ahead with a merit-based, needs-based approach. Means whoever needs the support, let's put them on in that basket, and we'll work together. And that's how the Bangsa Malaysia is going to forge forward. And honestly speaking, the privileged people who benefit from a disweighted equality framework will always be the last ones who want to give up their privilege and their special position. Because why is it when you can enrich yourself faster? And this is why I think it's time we have to call out that we're not going to wait for those who have already benefited from this privilege. It's time to say there was a moment for that privilege benefiting. And I think I support that NEP was needed in Malaysia, but the time has come for us to move to merit-based. And I think the proposal by the person earlier for an economic-based response for those in need, I think will be a way to build a Bangsa Malaysia.
Yeah. Thank you, Jerald. We have a few questions, but we are sort of running out of time. Just three questions from Halmi, but I'm going to cut short into it. But basically, the first is about the views on the global trends of increasing identity politics that weakens the international norms of institutions, law, and human rights. I'm going to combine these questions together with his next questions about whether do you think the legal or punitive measures is the best ways to forge the national unity. Can I address this to Dr. Ryans based on your work in KOMAS?
Okay, so I think as we can see, especially in terms of the international trend at this point of time, I mean, we can look at what has happened when Trump himself got elected, is that whole very white nationalist mentality and that it has also weakened certain forms of human rights and much more, especially in the US. But actually, I wanted to touch a little bit. I was actually very intrigued that the whole Bangsa Malaysia concept that you highlighted. I was actually wanting to answer that question. I mean, KOMAS currently is working. I'm actually heading a research with my group of colleagues, specifically on the whole notion of Bangsa Malaysia. And what we have done was we actually interviewed around 40 individuals, but they are not from like the ones who are privy to human rights issues and much more, but they are already members of the community. And though the analysis is not completed yet, but I can just share a little bit in terms of what I have heard firsthand in those interviews. I was actually rather appalled with the responses that were given. So in some of those conversations, there's still a very strong, deep-seated ethnic identity and the kind of recognition that is still very prevalent, not only within the Chinese, not only within the Malays, but almost every single participants that I've been speaking to. So, I mean, this is something which I kind of find quite rather interesting because a lot of them spoke about in terms of the need to preserve their own cultural identity, the need for them to practice their cultural beliefs, and much more. So these were some things that were actually highlighted by the people. So coming out with the whole notion of Bangsa Malaysia, we need to be very careful. Is this going to be a political construct? Or is this going to be something where you assimilate these groups of people to have one identity like what we see in Indonesia back then? If we are going to do that whole idea that what Suharto did in Indonesia back then, you definitely have a big chaos because everyone wants to preserve and protect their own cultural identity. So one of the proposed way forwards then is really the whole idea of multiculturalism, that we try to acknowledge everyone's cultural identities. But then you have another issue where everybody that we are facing here in Malaysia today, everybody wants to protect their own cultural identity and much more. So I think the bigger question here then is really one of the way forward then is we need to find a way where we can promote these forms of understanding. And one of the issues which were highlighted by most participants in the interview was that there's a lack of understanding, there's a lack of conversations among different races and ethnic groups. And there are groups of people who don't really know what are the practices of the Islams or the Malays. There are a group of people who don't understand what are the practices of the Indians. And that is where we are having an issue here today, because the lack of awareness, the lack of understanding, the lack of knowledge about the different cultural practices and beliefs that has led to this tension that we are facing today, the anonymity, the animosity that we are seeing within the different groups of people today. And this can be attributed to the long-term systemic discrimination that we are seeing in our policies that has transformed into what we are seeing today, the whole fragmented groups of people. You go to one taman, you see mostly all Chinese are staying together. You go to another taman, mostly all one group of Malays are all staying together. But then some of them were sharing that the differences that they have seen in the past is that they were living in a whole community, different groups of races staying together, living together harmoniously. That was the point. That was the tipping point where they were able to understand and learn about other cultures and much more. So any other superficial ways that we are trying to inculcate today in our education systems is not going to be helpful, because you are not immersing yourself into the lives of these people. And we are dealing with huge issues where the population now is fragmented in a very big way. I mean, I have so many other explanations in terms of how the different schools that we have, the 7 different streams of schools that we have, are also factors which has created the tension, that has created a fragmentation among the different ethnic groups. And I think this is something that we really need to think about it. But one positive thing that I can share from the research is that, not all hope is lost. Not all hope is lost. We can still find ways and solutions to this, and especially when we are talking to the younger generation, they have a different view of how things are going today. Most of them are in the idea that yes, we need to really have that kind of conversation with other groups, and we need to understand the cultural beliefs and the practices of these groups of people. So I think to answer Helmi's question, we really need to use these kind of spaces like TikTok, Instagram, and all that kind of stuff. Use those to leverage and to have those kind of discussion with the youth and the young today. We have a group of people who are already privy, like the older generation who lived through the experiences before of really good social dynamics and much more, able to speak to one another. And then now the younger generation, because they are exposed to social media, they're exposed to so many different kinds of media, they are a little bit more open as compared to the group who are in the middle, who are caught in between. They are not without much exposure to social media and much more. So that is one more key point that I wanted to say. In terms of Rukun Negara, it is a good idea, but again, the internalizing of it, how can we internalize them into our daily lives and much more? So we need to put our people into a very integrative approach to really understand, work together as a group. No use talking about the 5 principles of Rukun Negara every single day. I recite the Iqra. We speak about the 5 Rukun Negara every Monday, but that's all. Do we internalize that? That's a big question mark. All right, one more last key point I wanted to highlight here is in terms of the moderates. I think this is something which was highlighted to Dr. Wan Puspa. Actually, I had this conversation with my colleagues this morning while we were working online. But one of the ideas is that one of the biggest disappointment that we have is also with the moderates, especially we have the Malay Muslim moderates who often say, yes, I agree with whatever you're talking, but to the extent, but I also, but I do not agree with the actions that you're taking. And these groups of people, they are more devoted to what we call as the order of justice, who prefer negative peace, which is the absence of tension. Where we oftentimes, when we speak in terms of human rights language, they feel that when we demand something, when we speak human rights, it's creating tension. And this is a big issue here, So they always believe that, I agree with your goals, but I cannot agree with the actions that you are taking. And this is a big issue because how long are we going to wait? Really?
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a key thing that I wanted to highlight here. We really need to find a way that the moderates have to speak up. You cannot continue waiting. We need to come together to respond to this issue. Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Just the last one, very, very quick one. Sorry, Dr. Wan, because we are running out of time and we have to move to the closing remarks. Just very quick one about for the Malays. What will be appealing for the Malays to speak out against racial discrimination? So, quick answer, please. Thank you.
What would be appealing? I feel that anybody who has that justice and equality in mind, and wanting to have a better relationship, a better environment for all of us to live in, will be more than happy to speak on this. In fact, this is like the whole idea of intersectionality. I think earlier on, Mr. Jerald was also talking about intersectionality of the different groups, even among the Malays, among the Muslims, realize this too. And we have a lot, at least people around me, we have a lot of Malays who are open to talk about this. So you have any platforms, want to talk about this, let me know. I can supply people who want to talk about this because this is real. This is real. Like, for example, single mothers. I work with single mothers, but single mothers, the Muslim single mothers faces slightly differently. And then if it's rich Muslim single mothers versus poor Muslim single mothers, different story altogether with the whole court system. I can go on and on and on. So yes, have a platform. Let me know. I'll be more than happy to talk. I'll bring my gangbang in it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wan. So sorry that for the very last question that came in, I hope maybe Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Omar Abdul Rahman will be answer that in his closing remarks. So without further ado, I would like to invite Tan Sri for the from the Dialog Rakyat for the closing remarks, please, Tan Sri.
Assalamualaikum and Salam Harmony Musra. Well, I consider myself uninformed about the complex issues of or the problematic of human rights. So participation in this conversation has been an opportunity for me to learn. When preparing for this session, I realized, however, that I have been quite a while now an unconscious advocate of human rights. I will explain how this came about. One second slide. The next one, okay. So from a beginner, I have to look at what human rights means, and just to revise our memory, the generally accepted definition of human right is the basic rights and freedom that belong to every person in the world from birth until death, and so on and so forth. But the next slide, one. But the definition from UNICEF highlights another component of human right, which we seldom hear about, and this is the rights are standards that recognize and protect the dignity of all human beings. Human rights govern how individual human beings live in a society. Now I am using my iPhone, so now it is running out of battery. I have to plug the charger. Excuse me. It's the rights govern how individual human beings live in a society with each other. And then it is about individuals also have responsibilities in using their human rights. They must respect the right of others. I thought the responsibilities of individuals towards each other is one aspect of human rights that I think receive less attention than what governments do or don't do relative to human rights. In Malaysia, the government's failure to ratify ICET, for example, elicited a big civil society outrage. On the other hand, hate politics, the less than civil utterances and the toxic rhetorics with veiled racism of our politicians, especially around the time of general elections, receive more than just a whimper. It is this aspect of human rights that I would like to focus on. Next one. The insidious, divisive, and polarizing influences emanating from hate politics threaten our national cohesion, unity, and harmony, challenge our adherence to moderation, eroding our value system nurtured through generation, and perpetuating latent racial animus. They are actually infringement to human rights. And we tend to forget this. Now, I think Dr. Ryan brought up issues of rampant racism. There was this, I've not seen the racial discrimination report, but they have been called to preserve harmony by our leaders from time to time. And I just want to quote a few just after the the last election, because that's when racism became very rampant. Now, our Prime Minister in February 2019 Malaysia said that Malaysia must not be taken in or influenced by groups threatening the country's peace and harmony. Let us all pledge to defend stability, harmony, peace in this beloved country. And the Agong, September 2019, calls for the next one, Bun. Yeah, and the Agong, September 2019, calls for Malaysians to refrain from inciting misunderstanding by raising matters that could undermine and destroy harmony in this country. Next. Now, on his birthday message in 2020, again, the Agong said, I would like to remind all Malaysians to maintain unity and harmony we have largely enjoyed over the past 62 years, because many issues related to racial and religious sensitivities have been raised lately. Remove any basis for racial prejudice among people for the sake of unity, harmony, and the spirit of love for the country. Next one. It was the concern about the threat to our national cohesion and unity and social harmony, and the realization that their preservation is not just the responsibility of the government alone, but the shared responsibility that a number of civil society organizations, starting with ASLI, PICO, PAGE, MINDS, and so on and so forth, and with KSI now providing the support, this group came together to initiate Dialog Rakyat for National Cohesion and Unity in 2016. Next one. The Dialog Rakyat is a platform for constructive engagement of like-minded individuals and organization, not just to express our concern and assign blame, but to explore ways of what concerned individuals and organizations can do to counter racism and promote national cohesion and unity and social harmony. In other words, not pointing fingers, but saying what can we do as individuals and as groups of individuals. Next, please. So our first dialogue was convened in December 2016. And we came up with, after that dialogue, with a code of ethical conduct. I'm happy to hear Ryan, Dr. Ryan also has a code of ethical conduct. I think we might want to share notes on this one. But our code of ethical conduct is actually a tata peradaban, the principles on which we should behave with respect to one another. And this is based on the principle of smart partnership, simply respect, trust, transparency, tolerance, and accommodation, which is, as I said earlier, a set of behavioral guidelines for individuals to be adopted and to be promoted. Next one, please. Now, briefly, this is what our code of ethical conduct is. I just read a few aspects. To respect our federal constitution and rukun negara, to promote activities that nurture civic consciousness, civic nationalism, patriotism, national cohesiveness, harmony and unity at all levels of society. Advocate justice and fairness, transparency and integrity in all aspects of management and governance. Resolve contention and differences through constructive engagement, always seeking for equitable, mutually beneficial outcome. refrain from action that offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate others, reject any form of discrimination, bigotry, extremism, unjustified acts causing harm to any individual or group, including any action that disrupt harmony and cohesion. Fight corruption and kleptocracy at all levels and in all manifestations. This is part of our code of ethical conduct. Next one, please. And Dialog Rakyat strongly believes the adoption of the code of ethical conduct as a tata peradaban, the way we behave towards each other as citizens of Malaysia, will facilitate our challenging journey to sustain harmony. Now let's look at our journey to sustain harmony. There are 3 milestones. The first milestone is integration, simply coming together, working together, teamwork for specific purposes, sport, celebration, cultural event, gotong royong, even is eating musang king together. These are harmony moments. These are social behavior for short-term objective. Then we need to look at the second milestone. Next one, please. The second milestone is about cohesion. It is about deeper understanding of the reason and the principle for a longer-term bonding, cooperation, collaboration, partnership, security, stability, civility, survivability, and prosperity. This is Harmony Musra. I will come back to what is Harmony Musra. This is a rational behavior governed by the brain. The first one was social, short-term. This is rational, governed by the brain. The third milestone, next one please, is now unity. This is full commitment, collective responsibility, loyalty, shared destiny, civic nationalism, and patriotism. This is an emotional behavior governed by the heart. And we can reach this. We are on a good track. And therefore, sustained harmony, the final destination is, of course, after the social, the rational, the emotional, the sustained harmony. This is working together, understanding and respecting one another, living together, binded by the code of ethical conduct based on smart partnership principle. This is Harmony Musra environment, which is kesejahteraan negara. Next one, please. Now, Harmony Musra is the Dialog Rakyat strategic mission. We have 2-pronged strategic mission. One is nurturing Harmony Musra generation for Malaysia, focusing on the young generation of school and university communities. This is going down to the ground. Before COVID-19, we held altogether 3 dialogues with a number of schools in the Klang Valley and in Putrajaya, working together with the Ministry of Education, promoting our code of ethical conduct and talking about Harmony Musra. Our next one was promoting Harmony Musra Malaysian communities. This is for the adult population, focusing on neighborhood and business communities. We never get to the business communities because of COVID, but we did with the neighborhood communities, residents association, and Rukun Tetangga. We have done that as well. So we have gone down to the ground, bringing the idea of our Tata Peradaban. Next one, please. So now what is Harmony Musra? Well, it is recognizing the importance of and the need to increase harmony moments. We talked about harmony moments earlier. These are activities that bring members of communities together to interact, to socialize, to break down barriers, to exchange experiences, strengthen friendship, and rekindle the spirit of muhabbah, neighborliness. This constitute the social component. But we have to enhance harmony moment by instilling the rational elements through meetings and discussion and other means to promote the understanding of our national heritage, our cultures, our values, and national aspiration. So harmony moments happen all the time, but we have to build on that to strengthen our bonding with a rational reason for doing so. Next. And then we hope to introduce rituals and instruments that inspire the emotional attachment. We have a song actually. We have a Harmony Mesra Saling Hormati song, which we don't have time to play for you here today. It is the strengthening of the social with and spirit of goodwill among the citizens of Malaysia to secure, sustain, and enduring national unity, social harmony, leading to kesejahteraan negara. The Dialog Rakyat Code of Ethical Conduct is tata peradaban to embrace budi bicara, budi bahasa, budi pekerti, to nurture, promote, and strengthen harmony mesra. Next one, please. Dialog Rakyat strategic mission of nurturing harmony mesra Malaysian generation and promoting harmony mesra Malaysian communities engendered through the Code of Ethical Conduct originally intended to promote national cohesion and unity and social harmony have in effect been instruments of advocacy for human rights, in particular with respect to how individual human beings live in a society with each other and in respecting the right of others. This is how I come to be unconsciously advocating for human rights, and I think therefore Harmony Mesra Dialog Rakyat Code of Ethical Conduct deserve to be in the mainstream of the domestic human rights practices in Malaysia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, for sharing Dialog Rakyat's approach on the Code of Ethical Conduct and the Harmony Mesra. We definitely hope that these two approach is going to be put forward to the mainstreams, and hopefully I think we have a lot more to talk about as well. And I think with this, now it's 5:25. With this, I would like to thank all the panelists as well as our speakers and our attendees for giving this a very engaging conversation with us. And of course, this is not the end of these conversations when we talk about mainstreaming human rights and preserving national unity in Malaysia. And I hope some of the points that raised by panelists, by Tan Sri Omar, will be being put forward in discussions in the near future. So again, thank you to the co-organizers, KSI and the Dialog Rakyat as well. And I hope all of you stay well and have a good evening over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.